In my previous video, I null tested a bunch of EQs to make the point that if you know what you're doing, you don't need all of these different EQs, because EQs basically all just sound the same, and the plugin interfaces just fool you into thinking that they sound different when they don't. Testing the delta between two signals is like kryptonite to people who believe in the audio industry marketing hype. That's because it's cold, hard scientific fact, and science doesn't care about your feelings or your choice of adjectives that you use to describe the overpriced gear which you're in love with.
Warm,
detailed,
smooth,
dynamic,
transparent,
lush,
airy,
crisp, engaging. Right on cue, I got some disgruntled people in the comments section accusing me of having done it wrong. This video and many of the responses were only proof of one thing: it's confirmation bias, it's pure clickbait. I was waiting for you to pull up some UAD, Slate, or any newer analog model plugins from many newer developers. Let's see you null test those. Okay, let's do it. For the following null test, we're going to use white noise. That's the most critical and difficult thing to null because it's a random mix of all frequencies. So you need to get it absolutely perfect if it's going to null. So if it nulls significantly, then you know that it's pretty much more or less the same and you probably can't hear the difference. The Slate Digital SSL type EQ. And just for people who don't know what we're doing here, we start off with white noise with the fancy EQ on it. Then we take the same white noise with a non-fancy EQ or just a regular EQ, and we phase flip it, reverse it, so that when we add the two together, they cancel out if there's no difference. If there's a difference, what we're hearing is the difference. That's the delta. The delta is the difference between two signals. So if you can't hear the delta or it's really quiet, it means that there's no perceptual difference between the two. The Slate Digital Neve type EQ. Here's the 4000 series SSL EQ by SSL. SSL's X EQ. This is SSL's dynamic EQ variety. We're just going to use it in static mode. Now from Plugin Alliance, the Kirchhoff EQ. The Dangerous Bax EQ, also from Plugin Alliance. The Alicia EQ by Plugin Alliance. The Harrison Legacy EQ. Here's the Slate Digital Infinity EQ. Meg EQ2 developed by Brainworks through Plugin Alliance. The Millennia EQ developed by Brainworks, available through Plugin Alliance. Here's the SPL Pass EQ, available through Plugin Alliance. The Vice EQ1 by Softube. Now for Softube's Curve Bender recreation. This doesn't null very well because of the weird phase ripples in the high frequency. This doesn't sound good to me. There's a lot of weirdness going on in the high end. I would never use this personally, especially not professionally in mastering at all. However, because this is a null test and I'm trying to get these plugins to null, I have done this in two different ways. One way, I've just smashed an all-pass filter right up there in the higher frequencies to really rotate that phase, and surprisingly it nulls quite well. It's almost like they just whacked a all-pass filter in there just to mess with the phase so people would fail these null tests. However, I'm not exactly sure if that was what they actually did, if they just threw an all-pass filter in there just to mess with people. So for my second approach is a bit more brute force. I matched the phase response with a minimum phase EQ and then just even out the frequency response with a linear phase EQ, and then we perfectly match the frequency response and the phase response, and you can see that here with EQ Curve Analyzer. It's basically identical one-to-one in terms of the phase and in terms of the frequency response of the curve bender. Of course, we can A/B test it as well. To me, it sounds pretty close. I would never run my client's work through processing like this, ever. Another comment. So by your rationale, all car engines should sound exactly the same because they have the same components and do the same function. But that's not true. It is, each engine is tuned a little different. If you can get TDR Nova to sound exactly like a Pultec, then I would agree with you. Different EQs use different algorithms to enhance different harmonics. Challenge accepted. Let's get Nova to sound like a Pultec EQ. So I've got here the softube Tech EQ, which is supposed to be a Pultec. So let's have a look at that. So it nulls pretty well. The delta is quite low. And again, we're doing it with white noise, and white noise is quite unforgiving for doing these delta tests because it's a random mix of all frequencies. That's the definition of white noise. But let's now run some actual music through it, do an A/B comparison, and see if there's such a massive difference in the sound quality. But like I said in my previous video, it's not really important which particular EQ you use. It's important that you know how to use an EQ properly. A bad workman blames his tools. So after all this talk about EQ and all of the comments that I read, I decided I'm just going to make a course on EQ so I can do exactly that. Teach people how to use an EQ properly. So in this course, I'm going to be going through dozens of industry secrets, showing you how to use an EQ in the most effective way and in ways which you probably didn't even know existed. My goal is that by the time you finish the course, you're highly skilled at using any EQ gear. The gear doesn't matter. What matters is the skills. We're going to start right at the beginning with RC circuits, and we're going to go from there and talk about creative EQ, mixing EQ, mastering EQ. We're going to get into more esoteric and advanced stuff that you've probably never heard of, like intermodulation type effects. We're going to be talking about pre-emphasis. The release date is the 1st of June, so that's about a week from when I'm going to publish this video. So it's not a big time frame, but in this pre-order period, I'm going to be giving an early bird discount, a ridiculous 50%. You can check out the course on my website, apmastering.com. I'll leave a link down below with the code which you can copy and paste if you're interested in that course. But anyway, back to the video. Okay, so I believe you, we can recreate these weird curves with FabFilter or whatever other digital EQ. But I don't want to sit there and have to recreate them just because we theoretically can. I just want to have, for convenience sake, an EQ, I twist a knob and I get that sound immediately. And that's worth my money paying for this fancy interface that I've got that knob and I twist it and I get that weird curve right out of the box without having to sit there and try and recreate it. Why? Why do you want to do some weird EQ setting all the time? It may or may not have anything to do with the specific problem you're hearing in the mix that needs correction. And if this highly specific curve just happens to coincide with the exact problem that you have in your mix, well, it's a coincidence. A broken clock is right twice a day. And if you don't have a specific problem which needs corrective EQ, why are you using EQ in the first place? Just doing something with a plugin with a vintage fancy interface isn't going to impart analog warmth or whatever in your mix. If you think that, you've fully fallen for the plugin scam. If your workflow mainly consists of random knob twirling without a plan or direction of where you're going, then I guess that's probably fun if you're a noob, but that's not something that I'm interested in as a professional. Just because a plugin might faithfully mimic the frequency response from a blue metal box from the 1950s, so what? What does that have to do with my client's work which is in front of me and needs a specific tonal correction? What has that got to do with the end customer, the music lover, the person who's actually enjoying the music? They don't know what a Pultec EQ is. What has it got to do with them? So what's the truth? Well, sorry to disappoint the people who got tangled up in the marketing hype, but back in the late 1950s and early 1960s, mixing consoles looked like this. So let's compare that to an SSL a couple of decades later. You see the difference? There's basically nothing there. There's no parametric EQ and filters and compression and gating. You'd be lucky if you had 4 tracks. Now that's the era when Pultec EQs and Fairchild and Altec compressors were really popular because they didn't have anything else. If you didn't have a Pultec EQ, how are you going to EQ something? You don't have another EQ. Imagine you got in a time machine and you went back to the late 1950s and you went to one of the high-end studios of the day and you talked to the chief engineer and said, look, I see your EMT plate reverb and I see you've got a Fairchild compressor and an Altec compressor and you've got a couple of Pultec EQs here and I see that you've got a valve desk here and with these weird levers. That's really cool. I like that, but I've got something that you might like more. Check this out. This is called an Apple MacBook Pro from the future, from year 2015. And I'll give you this with a copy of Reaper and all of its built-in plugins and some 24-channel Motu, Behringer, whatever interface, and the USB cable and the plug. And you can have 24 mic inputs, unlimited tracks, all of the plugins which come with Reaper, and all of the delays and effects and reverbs and EQs and compression and limiting. Sell me all of your entire studio, the plate reverb, the Fairchilds, all of it. I want all of it, and I'll swap it for this one laptop and a 24-channel interface. What will he say? He'll say, yes, please. The engineers in the late 1950s and the early 60s, they wanted high-end digital precise EQs like FabFilter and TDR Nova. They wanted TDR Nova, but they didn't have TDR Nova. But you have TDR Nova for free. You'd happily trade the precise, high precision, high fidelity, amazing, transparent, digital miracle, parametric EQ of our day for some old wonky blue box that gets hot and has valves inside. Because old metal box though. Okay, sure, go for it. But what about the analog saturation? So for the most part, the types of EQs which people are thinking of when they think saturation, vintage vibe, vintage harmonic distortion, these types of EQs generally consist of 3 main components in their filter networks. They have resistors, capacitors, and inductors. And all 3 of these components are passive linear components. Linear meaning no saturation. They don't saturate. There's no saturation. There's no distortion. They're linear. They're clean, surgical, precise. A capacitor doesn't saturate. When we use words like distortion, saturation, harmonics, overtones, character, vibe, vintage sound, all of this stuff doesn't have to do with the capacitors, resistors, and inductors that are used in the filter network. Rather, this is the sound of transformers. Transformers saturate. And the amplifiers saturate and do weird non-linear stuff to the sound. It's the transformers and the amplifiers. Don't get me wrong, I absolutely love the sound of transformers. And I've built analog EQs before with my own hands, soldering all the components, and I'm selecting the transformers that I want to put in there. And if you like that sound too and want that saturation, why not use a plugin specifically designed to mimic transformers, like the True Iron plugin? If I want the sound of transformers, why would I randomly subject myself to unspecified mystery distortion in amounts that I can't control because it's built into some vintage EQ plugin? No, I'm just going to use the exact sound that I want with a specific transformer sounding plugin. It's like stepping into a music shop and saying, I'll have a musical instrument, please. What? Which one? What color? What size? You want a piano? You want a trumpet? You must have some idea what you want. No, I'll just have a musical instrument, please. Okay, well, here you go. Amazing! Yeah, this is exactly what I wanted. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out my other videos as this channel is dedicated to audio.